really hope you can get something out of the presentation. So, after I've gone through the whole thing, I'd love to hear your questions and any kind of thoughts you guys might have. So, as Donna mentioned, my name is Ira Cummings. I'm a brand strategist and designer. I really like to take a holistic approach to design. So that means a lot of different things, but type is always one of the fundamental characteristics. Feel free to reach out to me, any of the means above, and I'd love to hear your feedback, I'd love to hear your questions, so please don't be shy. To give you guys sort of an outline of some of the stuff that I'm going to cover, first off, I want to talk a little bit about why web type is important. And then I want to just generally cover some of the higher kind of concepts that will really help us to use web type well in a context. And then talk a little bit about how we would actually implement web type from a technical standpoint. And then if you guys run into any problems, talk about some solutions, and then hopefully kind of head off any sort of issues you might have before they actually become a problem. And then I want to talk about some of the really interesting things that people are doing with web type and kind of what's a little bit on the horizon and where things might be going. And then finally, I'll give you some resources to use for your own projects to get you really going and jump right into something using web type on your own. So as far as what we actually mean when we're talking about web type, in this context, we're talking about non-system fonts that will be hosted remotely and displayed on a screen. So that would be in contrast to what most people are used to using with web design, which would be the small set of web-safe fonts that the vast majority of users have installed on their computer. And it is definitely a contrast to typefaces and fonts that would be displayed and used in print design. You might think that this adds an extra level of complexity, and it certainly does. So really, we have to ask ourselves what the purpose of using web type is. From my standpoint, there are roughly three main reasons why you would use web type. The first one is branding. And in a lot of cases, this comes into play because whether it's a website or a web app or some other sort of public-facing or even internal project, it's part of a bigger message, and the type is one of the ways that we maintain a consistent message, which is really what branding is all about. The next important aspect would be for differentiation. If we have a lot of different people talking at us throughout the day in various different media, so how do we differentiate what we're saying through our content, and how do we separate that from what other people are saying? And what in typography is really one great way to do that. And finally, for your reader's sake, in the past, when designers have wanted to use unique typography, we've had to rely a lot on hacks and less than ideal solutions. So through the use of web type, we're able to use unique typography, but at the same time keep the content in the markup semantic, allow people with screen readers and other assistive technologies to still access the content easily, and it also allows for translation. So in order to use web type, we need to really understand how type is used and some of the conceptual ideas with type. It's a huge issue, so I'm just going to try to get some of the big blanket ideas, and we can kind of go from there. On a character level, there are a lot of different parts of a character that really define what the character is, and from a larger perspective, what the typeface's personality is. Each typeface has essentially four kind of imaginary lines that really make up its proportions. The baseline is the line which all the characters sit on. It's kind of the flat that you see sort of at the bottom of a line of text. And from the baseline, the characters reach up as far as about the cap height, which is the height of capital characters. And then in between is the X height, which is usually defined by the height of a lowercase x character, but says kind of a medium measure for the typeface. And then characters reach down to the descent, which is the lowest of the lines, and that's where the descenders are, which are the parts of a typeface that reach down below the baseline, which contrast with the ascenders, which reach from the x height up to the top of the cap height. Another characteristic that you want to note is whether the typeface has serifs or doesn't have serifs, serifs being little notches on the end of stroke of a character. And then the last really defining characteristic with a typeface is the counters. And the counters are the open spaces in a character, whether it's the center of an O or the opening on an E. These define really the lightness or the heaviness of a typeface. When we're dealing with content in sort of a longer format, we need to think about the characteristics of a paragraph. The main one to note is the measure, which is really the length of a line of text. An ideal measure is really what we're shooting for as a designer, but it depends on the typeface, it depends on what kind of content you're dealing with, but it usually ranges in about 40 to 65 characters. When you're dealing with a measure that's too long or too short, it causes eye strain for the reader and creates a rhythm that becomes a real challenge to read over time. So in this example, in this particular typeface and for a sort of longer format copy, a measure of about 55 characters works pretty well, but that would depend. So when you're working with type, it's one of those things where you set it and then see how it works and then try some different measurements. Another really important characteristic of a paragraph is the leading or the line height. So leading differs from line height in that leading is a measure that we've used traditionally in print media, and it is defined as the space between the bottom of the descent and the cap height of the next line below it. With line height, we're talking more about the distance from a baseline in a line of text to the next baseline below it. So it's a little bit different. Line height is what you would be using when we're talking about CSS, and so in your style sheets. So I use the term leading just so you know, because it's a frequently used typography term, but just take note of that. So when you're setting type, you're really shooting for, again, kind of a medium amount of line height. You don't want the paragraph to be too tight, and you don't want it to be too loose. When it's too tight, the text is difficult to read. It feels really heavy. When it's too loose, the content starts to break up. So you shoot for a middle ground, which has to be about 1.2 times your body text size. So that's a good measurement to start with. There are some examples, or here are some examples to exceptions to that 1.2% rule. When you're setting headlines, you usually set them with less line height. In cases when you have a really short or really long measure, a little bit more line height will really improve readability. So that's something that you kind of have to play around with and get a feel for. Another instance when you might want more line height is when you're dealing with a typeface that is really heavy. So in that case, a little bit more line height will make things feel a little bit lighter and not so dense. So we're talking a lot about how to make type readable for your audience. But that's only half the battle. I mean, we really want type that looks beautiful. We want users to really enjoy reading it and come back to our content and really, really appreciate the experience that we provide for them as designers. There are essentially three characteristics, three components of beautiful typography. The first one is contrast, and then rhythm, and finally spacing. When I'm talking about contrast in terms of typography, I'm really referring to whether the different parts of your content differentiate visually from each other. Do your headlines look different from your body content? And are you able to visually tell quickly and scan the content to see the headlines, to see the body, to see the notes? The tricky component of this is when things become too separate. So you want to have sort of a balance of content that, sorry. So you really want to strike sort of a middle ground of differentiating your content, but also at the same time having a cohesive feel to the content. So here are 4 different strategies for choosing different typefaces that work together well for your content. So in the top left is an example of a headline set in Gill Sans, and then the body content in Gaudi Old Style. And these typefaces work well together because they share a lot of similarities and similar sensibility. They're by different designers, but they're designed around the same time period, so they work well together. Another example in the top right would be an instance of 2 typefaces which both have a lot of personality. So Clarendon Bold and Trade Gothic both have really strong voice and really bring a lot of character to the message. So they offset each other, and they both speak strongly. On the bottom left is an example of a superfamily, in this case Scala, which has both a sans serif and a serif variety. And these typefaces were done by the same designer, so immediately they were intended to be used together. So that's one strategy to look for when choosing typefaces. And then finally, you can also use a single typeface, but set the different pieces of content in different ways of the typeface, like a bold for the headlines and a regular for the body content. When we're talking about rhythm with typography, we're really trying to establish a pattern for the reader. And this is something that readers look for when they're scanning content, as well as reading it, reading the full content. And it's one of those things that is less apparent when it's there, but more apparent when it's not. I hope you guys can see that this example lacks any sort of rhythm. The different type sizes were chosen at random, the spacing doesn't work well together, and it lacks any sort of sense of cohesion. One way to establish a sense of rhythm is with what's called a baseline grid. So what we do when we're establishing a baseline grid is trying to pick a number and then vertically align every component of the content to that line. So in this case, I've gone with a 20 pixel baseline grid and used that for the line height for the body content, used that for the spacing between the paragraphs, and doubled it for the line height of the headers. So I think it's pretty apparent that this holds together much better than the previous example. To give you kind of an idea of where the 20 pixel lines fall. Another example of a way to establish rhythm is through a modular scale. And these are a little bit more abstract, but they actually relate a little bit closer to your content. The way that you establish a modular scale is by starting with 2 numbers. I usually pick the base type size as the first number when I'm establishing a modular scale. And then the second number would be a number that relates well to your content. So in this case, I've chosen 40 pixels as a base touch target size. I might be working on a project that I'm intending a lot of mobile or tablet usage, so that makes a lot of sense to my users. Another number you might use is if you know your content's going to be at a certain size, that might be a number to choose, or maybe a measurement derived from the logo of your site, something that relates closely to your content. And then finally, you want to choose a ratio. So this is where things might start falling apart a little bit as far as making sense, but just go with me for a minute. So I've chosen the golden section as a ratio, which is a very traditional ratio, and then gone through the process of multiplying each of my two numbers by the ratio a bunch of times. So if you do this multiple times, you get a series of numbers, and I can use these numbers in my design to define measurements both vertically and horizontally, and thus create a sense of rhythm that brings the content together. I've used the scale that I pulled together on the previous slide, and you can see on the right-hand side is the list of numbers, as well as the ones that I've used for the design. For example, I've used 9.4 as the type size for the small sidebar type. I've used 22.6 for the line height, and I've used 406.4 for the length of the measure. I know it seems like a lot of math, and it might not make a lot of sense, but it's one of those things where you give me the benefit of the doubt and give it a shot yourself. There's an easy tool online, modularscale.com, that does all the math for you. You just kind of plug in the numbers, and it works really great. And it's one of those ones where if you start using it, I think you'll see how it really impacts your design. And the final consideration in beautiful typography is the negative space around your text and around your content. So we've talked a lot about the actual characters and the things that make up the type, but equally, if not more important, is the space around the type. And the spacing really helps users to see what's most important and really establishes a sense of hierarchy for your content. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, this is a really well-designed site. It's called The Verge, and they have editorial content that, they cover gadgets, but the way they present the content establishes a really clear hierarchy. They usually lead in with a prominent headline and a lead-in image, and then present the content, the longer form content, in a way that makes it really easy to read and intersperses the content with images, but the images are complementary, and it's always clear what's the most important. So with all that theory established, we can talk about how to actually start using WebType in your own projects from a technical standpoint. So when you're thinking about how to actually use WebType, you have essentially two options to go about it. The first option is a third-party service, and the way that it works is usually based on a recurring fee, usually monthly, either around bandwidth or page views or something to that effect. But they provide you with access to a large library of type, and then based on your selections, they give you a couple lines of plug-and-play code. You can drop those onto your pages. It's usually a little JavaScript tag, and then, some quick CSS to drop into your style sheet. So this is really a quick and easy way to start using WebType. Certainly the downfall would be you're kind of relying on someone else, so you give up some of the control, and so that's the main downside. You can also serve the font files from your own server, and then use the @fontface CSS attribute to point to the font files in your style sheet. They're really generally pretty easy to implement. The only thing to be aware of with using @fontface is you need to supply links to the right file types. So when we're talking about the actual code, it's really pretty straightforward. This is what you would use to serve one particular typeface. In this case, universe regular. So you can see this first. This would go directly into your style sheet, and in the first property, the font family property, we define the name of the typeface. And then the successive lines with the source, we provide links directly to the file formats. And you'll see in this case, I've included 3 different font formats, and I'll go into those formats in a second, but just to give you the warning that you need to specify more than one just to give the full cross-browser support. And then below, I'm using the universe regular in the font stack for my paragraphs. Just a quick note to include the font weight. It's just important to avoid some bugs later on down the line. So now, can we actually use this in our projects? It's great to use the latest and greatest, but how much do we need to worry about fallbacks? Fortunately, browser support's really pretty good. AddFontFace is supported by all of current browsers. There are some minor exceptions, but really, if you have the correct font files, you should be able to support every contemporary browser. When we're thinking about what file formats we need to supply, the first one to be aware of is EOT, which is a file format that works exclusively for Internet Explorer. So more modern versions of IE 9 and 10 especially support different file formats, but if you need to support legacy browsers, you'll need to supply an EOT file. OTF, TTF, and WOFF are more modern file formats. OTF and WOFF especially will give you the most complete feature set with a font, but those are supported by Mozilla and WebKit browsers. So that's really going to be the core of the file formats that you'll need to be aware of, and are additionally supported by newer versions of IE. And the last version, or the last file format, is SVG, which is a legacy format for older versions of iOS, Safari, Android, and Chrome. So with that groundwork laid, you can start working with web fonts right now, but there are a few problems that you might run into, and so let's talk about some possible solutions should they come up. From a technical standpoint, one of the main things to be aware of is download size. So with each font format, we're talking about anywhere from 25K to 250K per font file. So if you're specifying, a regular weight, a bold weight, an italic weight, you need to be aware that each additional font file is going to add to that